At a prestigious auction, an eccentric millionaire makes a bold bet that shocked everyone. He buys an untamable stallion for an exorbitant sum, determined to tame it himself. A journey of challenges, criticism, and self-discovery begins, revealing the true value of the connection between man and animal. Prepare yourself for a moving story of overcoming and transformation. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. What price freedom? What is a wild soul worth? In a world where everything seems to have a monetary value, there are treasures that defy any price tag. This is the story of a man who believed he could buy the untamable, only to discover that some connections are so precious they cannot be acquired with any amount of money. The auction hall gleamed under immense crystal chandeliers. Ladies and gentlemen of high society, dressed in their finest attire, moved among champagne flutes and whispered conversations. The air carried a mix of expensive perfumes and anticipation, but no presence was as notable as that of Edward Miller, the real estate magnate who had just entered the room. Tall, with his perfectly trimmed gray hair and an Italian suit that cost more than many earned in months, Edward emanated an almost palpable confidence. His eyes, a penetrating blue, scanned the room as if assessing not people, but potential acquisitions. He was known for turning everything he touched into gold. Abandoned properties became luxury condos. Forgotten lots transformed into majestic skyscrapers. The buzz quieted as the side doors of the hall opened. It was time for the most anticipated lot of the evening. A stallion black as the darkest night appeared, led by 3 handlers who could barely control its immense strength. The animal neighed, rebellious against the ropes that bound it. Its mane seemed to dance in the wind, like black flames consuming the air around it. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the auctioneer, adjusting the microphone, "I present to you Tempest. From the wild lands of the West, this magnificent specimen has never been ridden. 3 professional trainers have given up on taming him. His lineage is impeccable, but his spirit—" He paused dramatically, watching the animal rear violently. "His spirit remains untouched. We start the bidding at $50,000. Silence fell over the hall. Despite the animal's undeniable beauty, who would risk so much money on a horse nobody could control? Tempest neighed again, as if laughing at human hesitation. $100,000. A voice cut through the silence. All heads turned to Edward, who remained standing, a glass of champagne in hand, apparently indifferent to the astonishment he had caused. The auctioneer, recovering from his surprise, smiled. "We have 100,000 from Mr. Miller. Anyone? Offer 110? Absolute silence. 200,000. Edward increased his own bid, eliciting audible gasps. A well-known horse breeder sitting in the 3rd row timidly raised his hand. 210. Edward didn't even blink. 500,000. A murmur of shock swept through the room. The animal was worth, at most, 1/10 of that value. The auctioneer, his hands slightly trembling, looked around the hall. 500,000 from Mr. Miller. Anyone offer more? When the gavel fell, sealing the most expensive sale in the auction's history, Edward Miller didn't smile. In his eyes there was only the cold determination of someone who had just acquired not a horse, but a new challenge to be conquered. "Are you insane?" murmured Sarah, his personal assistant, as they walked out of the hall. "500,000 for a horse that will probably break your neck the first time you try to ride it?" Edward adjusted the gold watch on his wrist. "You know what they say about impossible things, Sarah. They're just the ones nobody had enough courage to achieve." The news spread like wildfire. The next morning, all the major newspapers in the country featured variations of the same headline: "Magnate pays fortune for untamable horse." Some articles were respectful, others mocking. A particularly biting columnist wrote, "In a time when children still go hungry in our country, Edward Miller found a better use for his money. An equestrian whim that will likely end up sold for slaughter when he tires of the game." Edward wasn't a man to read criticism, but that one stung his pride in a way he wasn't prepared for. Sitting in his panoramic office from where he could see half the city he had helped build, he threw the newspaper onto the glass desk. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow," he ordered Sarah, and hire the 3 best horse trainers in the Tame country. I don't care what it costs." Sarah hesitated, her fingers hovering over the tablet. "Edward, you're not actually going to try to tame this animal, are you? The experts said he's practically wild. It's not like acquiring a struggling company and restructuring it." Edward's eyes hardened. "Exactly. Companies are predictable, Sarah. Numbers, charts, people desperate for salaries. This," he pointed to the photo of the black stallion in the newspaper. "This is a challenge worthy of me." At the press conference, under the watchful eye of dozens of cameras, Edward made an announcement that generated even more buzz. "In exactly 1 year, I will present Tempest at a charity event I will organize for the new children's hospital. And I will not only present him tamed, but I myself will ride him." Questions came like an avalanche. "Mr. Miller, do you have riding experience? Wouldn't it be more prudent to leave this to professionals? Are you doing this just for publicity?" With the same coldness with which he closed multi-million-dollar deals, Edward replied, "I learned to ride as a child on my grandfather's farm. No, it wouldn't be more prudent because I'm tired of doing only what is prudent. And as for publicity," he paused, his eyes meeting the main camera, "if it's to promote the construction of a hospital that will save hundreds of children a year, then yes, let the publicity come." The first 3 months were a complete disaster. Edward hired, as promised, the best trainers in the country. One after another, they left his property with defeated expressions. The last one, a Texas cowboy with over 30 years of experience, was more direct. "Mr. Miller, in all my life, I've never seen an animal like this. He has no fear, and that makes him impossible to train. We use fear to teach limits, to establish respect. But this stallion..." The man took off his hat, running, a hand through his thinning hair. "He fears no whip, no confinement, nothing. And an animal without fear is an animal that cannot be broken." Edward, sitting on the porch of his country estate, watched the horse in the distance, galloping freely in the enormous enclosure he had had specially built for him. "I don't want to break him," he finally replied. "Breaking is what they do to weak spirits. I want to win him over." When the last trainer left, Edward made an unusual decision. He dismissed almost all the ranch staff, keeping only the essentials for basics, maintenance. He canceled all meetings for the next 2 months and moved permanently to the country property. "You're going to abandon the company in the middle of the South Tower negotiation?" Sarah couldn't hide her astonishment. Edward was busy packing. A small bag. No expensive suits or Italian shoes, just jeans, flannel shirts, and sturdy boots. "I'm not abandoning anything. I'm delegating. That's what the vice presidents and directors I pay so well are for." He closed the bag with a decisive movement. "It's time to remember who I was before I became this." He gestured vaguely to the reflection in the mirror, as if he no longer recognized the man with gray hair and a stern expression looking back at him. The first month on the ranch was a period of painful adjustment. Accustomed to extreme comfort and a meticulously planned schedule, Edward now woke up to the birds chirping and slept to the distant howl of wolves in the mountains. His skin, previously protected in temperature-controlled environments, now burned under the relentless sun of days working in the fields. Every morning he walked to Tempest's enclosure, carrying a simple wooden chair. He placed it about 30 feet from the fence and simply sat there, observing the stallion for hours on end. The animal at first stayed as far away as possible, running in nervous circles at the far end of the plot. "He still doesn't trust you," commented Joe, the old foreman who had looked after the property for decades. He was a simple man, with calloused hands and few words. Edward, without taking his eyes off the animal, replied, "Neither would I if I were him. All he's known from humans so far is pain and attempts at subjugation." The old man smiled discreetly, surprised by the insight of his city boss. By the end of the second week, there was a subtle change. Tempest still kept his distance, but no longer ran frantically. Sometimes he would stop and look directly at Edward, as if trying to decipher the intentions of this strange human who just watched, without ever trying to approach. "You should bring an apple or a carrot," Joe suggested one morning, holding out some fresh fruit for Edward. Maybe it will help break the ice. Edward took the apples, thanking him with a nod. He wasn't a man of many words with subordinates, but something was changing in him too, as slowly as the horse's trust grew. Small gestures like saying thank you, looking employees in the eye, or even asking about their families, behaviors that previously would have seemed absurdly unnecessary to him. On the 40th day, the first big breakthrough happened. Edward was in his usual spot, reading aloud from a book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He had discovered that reading aloud not only filled the silence, but also accustomed Tempest to the sound of his voice. It was then, in the middle of a particularly poetic paragraph, he felt a warm breath on the back of his neck. He froze immediately. With movements of studied slowness, he turned his head slightly. There was Tempest, less than 3 feet away from him, on the other side of the fence. His nostrils flared, inhaling the human scent. His black eyes fixed, intelligent, penetrating. Edward continued reading, his voice now a trembling whisper. The horse remained there for almost 5 minutes, before calmly walking away, without the usual nervous gallop. When the animal finally distanced itself, Edward realized he had tears in his eyes. He who hadn't cried since his mother's death 15 years ago. That night, sitting on the porch with a simple cup of coffee, not the imported espresso he was used to, Edward reflected on the almost mystical moment he had experienced. That's when Joe appeared, his face shadowed by his worn hat. "Boss, there's a man wanting to speak with you, says it's important." The visitor was an official from City Hall, carrying a briefcase full of documents and maps. Without much preamble, he explained the situation. A new state highway was planned to pass exactly through those lands. The government was offering generous compensation, but eminent domain was inevitable. The papers were almost all approved already. "How much time do we have?" Edward asked, his mind already calculating possibilities. 6 months at most. Construction starts right after the rainy season. After the official left, Edward remained on the porch for hours, watching the stars he could never see in the city. The idea of losing that ranch, which before was just one investment among many others, now deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just the money, it was something harder to define, a connection to the land, to the silence, to the natural rhythm of things he had rediscovered there. And of course, there was Tempest. What would become of the animal if the ranch was destroyed? The next morning, Edward started making calls, not to his usual corporate lawyers, but to environmental activists, local politicians, journalists who covered the rural area. A mobilization was starting to form. Meanwhile, his relationship with Tempest continued to evolve. Now, the horse allowed Edward to approach the fence, and sometimes ate apples directly from his open hand. Every small step forward was celebrated as a major victory. It was during this period that Edward noticed something curious. Tempest seemed particularly calm on mornings when an elderly mare with a light bay coat grazed in the neighboring field. She belonged to a small adjacent property, owned by a widowed lady who lived alone. "Mrs. Davis has raised horses since she was a girl," explained Joe, when asked about the neighbor. "That mare, Serenity, must be about 20 years old now. She was her husband's last gift before he died." Edward observed the two animals for several days. Although separated by a fence, there was a silent communication between them. Tempest, always so restless, became almost docile in the presence of the old mare. "It's like she calms him down," he commented, more to himself than to Joe. The old foreman smiled. "Sometimes we need someone to remind us who we really are, boss, even the bravest among us." The phrase echoed in Edward's mind for days. Who was he really? The ruthless businessman who had built an empire on aggressive deals and calculated opportunism? Or this other man he was discovering, capable of sitting in silence for hours, appreciating the simple miracle of slowly earning the trust of a wild creature? The first time Edward entered the enclosure was almost an accident. He was putting fresh apples in the trough, as he did every morning, when the gate he usually locked carefully failed and swung open with a creak. Tempest, who was grazing a few feet away, snapped his head up sharply, his eyes fixed on the now unprotected human. Edward froze. All the experts had warned. Never show fear. But how could he not fear a creature of almost 1,500 pounds of pure, muscular strength capable of killing him with a single kick? Time seemed to stop as the two stared at each other. Then, surprisingly, it was Tempest who took the first step in Edward's direction. "It's okay," Edward murmured, more to control his own fear than to communicate with the animal. "It's okay, boy. It's just me." Step by deliberately slow step, the stallion approached until he was less than an arm's length away. Edward could feel the heat emanating from the animal's powerful body. He could see every detail of his deep eyes. He could hear his rhythmic breathing. With infinite caution, Edward raised his hand, holding it suspended in the air. The invitation was made. Now it was up to Tempest to decide. The seconds dragged on like hours. Then, the unimaginable happened. The stallion took the final step and brought his muzzle to the extended hand, allowing the touch. The animal's skin was softer than Edward had imagined, warm and vibrant with life. Silent tears streamed down the face of the man who, for the first time in decades, felt truly connected to another living being. "Thank you for trusting me," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The next day, when Joe arrived for his morning tasks, he found Edward asleep leaning against a tree inside the enclosure, with Tempest grazing peacefully a few steps away. The old foreman smiled, shaking his head. "The animal tamed the man," he murmured to himself. The weeks that followed brought rapid progress. Edward started bringing a soft brush every morning, and Tempest soon learned to appreciate the ritual of having his black, shiny coat carefully brushed. Sometimes the stallion even lowered his head, as if he wanted to make it easier for Edward to access his tangled mane. In parallel, the fight to prevent the ranch's eminent domain gained strength. The story of the millionaire who had abandoned city comfort to forge a bond with a wild horse had captured the public's imagination. Journalists appeared frequently, and Edward, previously averse to any personal exposure, now welcomed them willingly, always with Tempest in the background, getting closer and closer. "Do you really intend to ride him by the end of the year?" asked a young reporter, clearly skeptical. Edward, now with tanned skin and expression lines he didn't have before, the result of smiles he rarely offered before, replied with a newfound tranquility. "That depends on him, not me. I'm learning that some things cannot be forced or rushed. They happen in their own time, when mutual trust exists." The reporter seemed surprised. "This doesn't sound like the philosophy of the man who built the country's largest real estate empire in record time." Edward laughed, a sound his former associates would barely recognize. "Perhaps I'm learning a new philosophy, one that might have saved me from many mistakes in the past." The gravity of these mistakes became clearer to Edward as he spent more time away from the office. Deals he had closed without considering the environmental impact. Entire communities relocated to make way for his ventures. Lives transformed, not always for the better, by his cold, calculating decisions. The weight of these realizations led him to a sleepless night. In the early hours, unable to stay still, Edward walked to Tempest's enclosure. The stallion, sensing his presence, approached the fence. "You know," Edward said in the darkness, "I think I understand why you resisted so much. Freedom isn't just the absence of physical chains. It's being able to be who you truly are, without compromise, without falsehood." He ran his hand along the animal's neck. "I spent so much time building a life that imprisoned me in expectations, in a public image, in a character that isn't me." Tempest snorted softly, as if he understood. "If we can stop this road, I promise you'll always have a choice. I'll never try to force you into anything again." The next morning, Edward woke up with a decision made. He called Sarah and gave precise instructions. Half of his personal fortune would be transferred to a newly created foundation, dedicated to environmental preservation and animal rescue. "Are you sure?" Sarah's voice betrayed her concern. "Edward, that's billions of dollars." "I've never been more certain," he replied, watching through the window as Tempest ran freely across the field, his black mane dancing in the wind. "Besides, how much money does a man need, Sarah? I already have more than I could spend in several lifetimes." The movement against the highway grew exponentially after the Foundation announcement. Environmentalists who had previously seen Edward as an enemy now embraced him as an ally. Politicians, sensing the shift in the winds, began to reconsider the original route of the road. The small rural community around the ranch, who had previously seen the millionaire as a city intruder, now welcomed him with warm smiles. Mrs. Davis, the elderly neighbor, became a frequent visitor. She brought homemade cakes and shared stories of how she had raised horses her whole life. "Serenity was the only one I managed to keep," she explained one day, as they watched the elderly mare interacting with Tempest through the fence separating the properties. "When my husband died, the debts almost swallowed me whole. I had to sell all the others." Edward listened with genuine interest, another new behavior. Before, he rarely paid attention to personal stories, especially from people he would have considered commoners. "What if I bought your property?" he suggested suddenly. "For double the market value. You could continue living there, of course. The house would be yours until, well, forever. But the fields would become part of my ranch." Mrs. Davis stared at him, suspicious. "And why would you do that?" Edward pointed to the two horses. "So they can stay together and to protect more land from eminent domain." The idea evolved quickly. Soon Edward wasn't just buying Mrs. Davis's property, but negotiating with other small landowners in the area. His vision expanded, not just to save his ranch, but to create a sanctuary for rescued horses, an environmental preservation area that would serve as a permanent barrier against uncontrolled urban sprawl. Ironically, the man who had dedicated his life to transforming natural lands into concrete and steel now fought with equal fervor for the preservation of the green. The 7th month since buying Tempest was approaching, and Edward still hadn't tried to ride him. Not for lack of opportunity. The bond between the two was now so strong that the stallion followed him like a shadow across the fields, like a loyal dog would follow its owner. "I don't understand why you're hesitating," commented Sarah during one of her rare visits to the ranch. "The horse clearly trusts you, and the charity event is getting closer." Edward was brushing Tempest, who remained perfectly still under his care. "It's not a matter of trust, Sarah. It's a matter of choice." "Whose choice, yours or his?" she asked, confused. "His," Edward replied simply. That night, after Sarah left, Edward sat on the porch, contemplating the stars. Tempest, free to roam. The property, now that Edward had removed all the internal fences, approached and lay down on the grass near the wooden steps. "Do you know what impresses me most about you?" Edward said, as if talking to an old friend. "Your dignity. You could have given in long ago, could have let the trainers tame you to escape confinement, the whip. But you chose to keep your essence, even if it meant more suffering." The horse raised his head, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I gave in so many times," Edward continued, his voice now almost a whisper. "I gave in to the pressure to grow quickly, to be richer than my father, to prove my worth through material achievements. And with each concession, I lost a little bit of who I truly was." Tempest stood up and, in a surprising movement, approached the steps where Edward was sitting. He lowered his imposing head until it was level with the man's face. What happened next, Edward could never explain rationally. It was as if for an instant he could see through those black eyes, feel what the animal felt. A communication beyond words, beyond conventional human understanding. "You want to try, don't you?" Edward murmured, feeling an inexplicable certainty. "You're ready." The next morning, Edward didn't bring the usual brush. Instead, he carried a light saddle, the most comfortable he could find. He showed it to Tempest from a distance, giving the animal time to inspect the object, to understand his intentions. The stallion remained still, eyes fixed on the saddle. After a few minutes, he slowly approached and sniffed the leather. "Only if you want to," Edward said softly. "If you show any discomfort, we stop immediately." With deliberately slow movements, Edward positioned the saddle on the animal's back. Tempest flinched slightly but didn't back away. The horse's breathing quickened slightly as Edward carefully tightened the straps, ensuring the saddle was secure without hurting him. "Okay so far?" Edward continued speaking, his voice a reassuring anchor for both of them. Shall we try the next step? Without using stirrups, Edward placed his hands on the horse's back and, with a fluid movement, rose and mounted. Tempest's entire body tensed. For a terrifying moment, Edward thought he had made a terrible mistake, that he had betrayed the animal's trust. But then, gradually, Tempest relaxed. His breathing returned to normal. He moved his head to the side as if wanting to check who was on him, and upon confirming it was Edward, he seemed to accept the situation. "Good boy," Edward whispered, leaning down to stroke the animal's neck. "You're incredible, you know." They remained like that for a few minutes, Edward sitting still, Tempest standing, both getting used to this new configuration of their relationship. Then, very gently, Edward pressed his knees against the horse's flanks, signaling he was ready to walk. Tempest's first step was hesitant, the second more confident. On the third, something extraordinary happened. The horse everyone called untamable began to walk calmly, responding to the rider's slightest cues, as if the two were a single creature. Tears streamed freely down Edward's face as they walked slowly across the field. They weren't tears of victory or conquest, but of profound gratitude. Gratitude for this invaluable gift, the voluntary trust of a being who could have chosen to reject him. The following weeks were filled with constant practice. Edward never forced Tempest into long sessions, always respecting the animal's pace. Gradually, they progressed from walking to light trots, and finally to controlled canters across the vast fields of the expanded ranch. News of the successful taming spread quickly. Journalists returned en masse, now accompanied by television crews. The story of the transformed millionaire and the untamable horse had captured the national imagination. It was during one of these filming sessions that the incident happened that would change everything again. Edward and Tempest were demonstrating their harmonious partnership for the cameras when the stallion suddenly stopped. His ears pricked up in alarm. Before Edward could react, the horse bolted towards a wooded area, completely ignoring the rider's commands. "Tempest, what is it?" Edward held on tight, allowing the animal to take him wherever he was going with such urgency. They reached a small ravine, where the sound that had alerted Tempest became audible to Edward too. A high-pitched, desperate whimpering. At the bottom of the ravine, a wolf pup was caught in an illegal hunter's trap, its paw bleeding as it struggled uselessly to free itself. Tempest stopped at the edge of the steep slope, neighed loudly as if calling for help, and looked at Edward, as if expecting him to understand what needed to be done. "How did you hear that from so far away?" Edward murmured, dismounting carefully. "Wait here, I'll help him." The descent was dangerous, with loose rocks threatening to slide with every step. The pup, terrified, tried to bite when Edward approached. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, using the same tone he used with Tempest in the early days. "I'm here to help." With extreme care, Edward managed to open the trap and free the animal's injured paw. The pup, though free, was clearly weakened by blood loss in the effort of trying to escape. "I can't leave him here," Edward decided, removing his shirt to create an improvised sling for the little wolf. "Let's take him home and take care of that paw." When he returned to the top of the ravine with the pup, Edward found not only Tempest, waiting patiently, but also the film crew who had followed them, capturing the entire rescue operation. The wolf pup incident went viral instantly. The image of the powerful businessman gently rescuing an injured wild animal, guided by his horse previously considered untamable, was too powerful to ignore. The next day, the state governor personally announced that the highway's route would be altered, completely preserving Edward's land and the emerging wildlife sanctuary he was creating. "Sometimes," the politician declared in front of the cameras with Edward and Tempest in the background, "we need to recognize when we are on the wrong path. Development is important, but not at the cost of destroying such special relationships between humans and nature as the one we've witnessed." The victory against the highway was just the beginning. Donations for Edward's foundation began arriving from all over the country. The sanctuary expanded rapidly, welcoming not only rescued horses but various species of wild animals harmed by urban sprawl. And at the center of it all was the extraordinary partnership between a man who had learned to value much more than money and a horse who had chosen to trust, despite every reason not to. The big charity event, originally planned as a mere taming demonstration, transformed into something much bigger. It became a celebration of transformation, not just of Edward and Tempest, but of an entire community that now understood the value of preserving instead of exploiting. On the night of the presentation, under soft spotlights and before an audience that included everyone from celebrities to the simple local residents who had witnessed the entire journey, Edward rode Tempest bareback with just a light rope as a guide. "A year ago," he said into the microphone clipped to his lapel as Tempest walked majestically around the arena, "I believed I could buy and tame anything, that my will and my money could bend the world to my desires." Tempest performed a series of complex movements, responding to Edward's slightest cues, a harmonious dance between man and animal. "Today, I know that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought. They can only be offered freely, through trust, respect, and genuine love." With these words, Edward slid from the horse's back and removed even the rope that served as a symbolic guide. Completely free, Tempest could have chosen to run, return to his wild state, reject everything they had built together. Instead, the magnificent black stallion circled the arena once and then returned to stop beside Edward, lowering his imposing head so the man could stroke his muzzle. The audience rose in a spontaneous ovation. Many wept openly, touched by the pure demonstration of a connection that transcended words. "What I learned from Tempest," Edward continued when the audience finally quieted, "is that true freedom isn't the absence of bonds. It's the presence of connections we freely choose to keep, that strengthen us instead of imprisoning." "Sue," he paused, looking at the horse with tear-filled eyes. "A year ago, I paid $500,000 for a horse everyone called untamable. It was the best purchase of my life, not because I managed to tame him, but because he taught me to be untamable. Again. To rediscover my own wild essence, which had been tamed by years of compromises with a value system I never truly believed in." The main camera zoomed in, capturing the intimate moment between man and animal. "Today, I officially announce the creation of the Tempest Sanctuary, dedicated not just to rescuing animals, but to rescuing our human connection with the natural world. A place where people of all ages can come to learn what this magnificent being taught me, that the deepest lessons often come packaged in the most unexpected ways, and that it's never too late to rediscover who we truly are." As Edward and Tempest walked side by side from the arena, not as master and servant, but as equal partners on an extraordinary journey, the applause continued for long minutes. Mrs. Davis, sitting in the front row with Serenity peacefully resting in a special enclosure near the arena, smiled through her own tears. "See," she whispered to the old mare, "I said that man had a chance at redemption. Sometimes all we need is to find the right mirror to show us who we really are." And so, under the stars of a perfect night, a man, who had once believed everything had a price, discovered the invaluable worth of a single true connection. And a horse everyone called untamable freely chose to remain by the side of the only human who had respected his essential nature. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where true wealth would be measured, not in bank accounts or properties, but in the depth of connections forged and the lives transformed along the way. As the lights slowly faded over the arena, the silhouette of man and horse against the night horizon seemed to form a single creature, two spirits who, in their dance of patience and mutual respect, had achieved something far more precious than domination. They had found that rare and precious harmony that arises only when we allow other beings to be truly free, and discover that, in their freedom, they choose to stay by our side.